Hey class, this is me at the end of the video, just kind of showing you where this is headed. So here's my new class portfolio. If I click on project number 1, you can see what we're working on today. There's the art from our Piskel video. And if I hit the up arrow or some of the other arrows, we get that walk animation and our character moves around the screen. So we're going to be using this project as a way to review some basic JavaScript stuff and P5 stuff with the variables, logic, and events as well. Just showing you guys where this is headed, and now we'll get into creating this new project. Since this is the beginning of the semester, I am going to go through setting things up again. That might be a little tedious, but feel free to just skip this section and start from the project we did in the last video. But I'm going to go over setting up the HTML and CSS and setting up P5 and everything else again, just to kind of review that stuff. I'm going to start with my MMP 310 folder, and I'm just going to drag this over to the Sublime text. And I'm going to open this up, and we can see we did this Piskel project in the last video. I'm going to add a new project here, and we're going to be reviewing three main concepts in this video. We're going to be reviewing variables, logic, and events. So we'll go through each one of those as we approach them. A couple things I'm going to do is just go over how to set up the project and add P5. So to get started, I'm going to hit Command N in Sublime Text to create a new file. And then I'm going to save it. And I'm going to go back to my MMP 310 folder. So I want to make sure I'm on the desktop, MMP 310. And so I'm going to call this project 1. So this will be our first project that we'll get started with. We are going to add a bunch of stuff to this over the next couple of weeks. So we'll just call it project 1 for now. If you want to give it a different name, feel free to call it whatever you like. So I'm going to call this project 1, and we can add a link here. So I'm going to save this file as index.html. So this will be kind of, the main HTML page. It's always going to be index.html in the new folder. And just a reminder, the I is lowercase. So I'm going to click save, and I'm just going to make this index page. As normal, I'm going to do a doc type HTML. So we're just saying this is an HTML document. And then we have our HTML node to start. And then we have our two main sections of our HTML, the head section, where we have some information about how the page works that we don't see on the page itself. And then we have the body section where the content of the page will go. So in the head section, I'm just going to add a title, call this project 1. Maybe we'll come up for a name for it later. And then I'm going to link to the style sheet. So again, I'm going to link to the main style sheet that I have outside of this folder in my MMP 310 folder. So if I open up the Finder, and go to the desktop, MMP 310. So right now we're working on project 1, and we're at this index.html. But we want to reference this main style sheet in our main project folder. So I'm going to go back one directory. So I have to go back here, and we use the .. slash to say that. So I still use the regular link tag and href, and I start with .. slash and then style.css. That way we don't have to keep copying the same style sheet. And if we want to add more styles to this, we can also make a style sheet inside this folder. So I'm going to do the rel attribute is style sheet, and the type attribute is text/CSS. And then the last thing I'm going to add in here is my meta char set gets UTF-8. This is just to be web compliant, but it's good to have that in there. So that's basically what I've got for the HTML page. Now I'm going to set up my P5. I already have a copy of the library here, but just to quickly review, if you don't have a copy of the library, you can go to Chrome. So I'm going to open a new Chrome window, and you would just go to the P5 website. So I'll just go to P5.js. It's going to autofill if you've been there before, but if you just Google P5.js, it should be the first thing that comes up. Or you can go to p5js.org. And then you're going to go to the downloads page, And then for now, we're only going to be using the regular library, so we don't need the whole thing. We might add some sound and stuff later. For now, we're just going to click on p5.min.js, and that is going to go to our downloads folder. So to get that into our project folder, we just go back to the Finder, and I'm going to open up a couple windows here. So I'll make a new window here. You can also do this with tabs. If you want to do Command T, you can, drag it that way. So I'm going to go to the downloads folder. There's P5. I'm just going to preview it and make sure it's the most recent copy. So it was published very recently, July 22nd, 2020. So that's good. And I'm going to drag that into my project folder. I already have a copy, so it's asking me if I want to, do this, and I'm just going to say replace. If you already have a copy, you don't need to do this. I'm just going over what to do if you need a copy of it. So I'll leave the P5 website here for now and go back to Sublime Text. And so we're going to reference P5 in the same way that we referenced our style sheet. So I'm going to use a script tag here. If you do in Sublime and some of the other editors, if I do a complete here using the tab button, I get this type equals text/JavaScript. I want to make sure that, type is actually not the correct attribute here. It is if you want to use it, but what we really need here is the source. So you can leave that type here and then just add source. And then we're going to go back one directory and grab p5.min.js. And so this way we don't have to have multiple copies of the library in all of our project folders. So I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to add my final script, which is the sketch. So I'm going to say sketch.js. That's kind of the convention with P5. We talk about using sketches. You could call this file really whatever you want as long as you use the right name in the reference. The reference is just right here, sketch.js, and we're going to create that file. Before I do that, I'm going to preview this page. So I'm going to go to Tools and Sublime Server and make sure to click Start Sublime Server if you haven't already. And once you do that, you can go back to Chrome and go to the localhost 8080 and then click on MMP 310. And you'll see the class portfolio. So what we want to do is hook up this link to project number 1. And so we need to edit the main class portfolio page to do that. So I'm going to go back to, here's MMP 310, and here's my index.html. So yours folder might be called class portfolio, whatever it is. Just click on index.html and scroll down here to project number 1, and we can just fill in here. So it's actually just project 1. We can come up with a name for this later. And if you want to go ahead and delete these other projects, feel free, but we can leave them there as placeholders for now. And so we'll click on project 1, and at the end of the video, I'll come back and I'll change this thumbnail once we have something that we can put here. So I'm going to click on project number 1, and we're not going to see anything here because we haven't actually added our sketch yet, but I'll go ahead and open up the inspector, and we can go to elements, and we can kind of see that, our HTML that we created is right here. But since we didn't actually add the script yet, we're going to get an error that says it couldn't find the script. So when we add sketch.js, then we will be able to start with the program. So I'm going to leave this open to the console in case I have any errors later. So I always have the console open when I'm working on a JavaScript project. That way I can see any errors as soon as they happen. So I recommend keeping this open and, just refreshing this whenever you change your code. So now let's go ahead and start writing some code. Okay, so we're going to get back into some P5. Hopefully you guys still remember a lot of this from MMP 210. If it's been a while, I will kind of try to go over the basics as we're going over it. We are going to kind of review a lot of stuff in this video. So if you have any issues, I'm going to include a bunch of links to other videos and other things to look at as well if you need to catch up or refresh on stuff. And we can also talk about stuff in class or on Discord. We are going to add some art. We created a couple character art in our Pascal project. So we have this Jerry Idle animation, and then we have the Jerry Walk animation. I'm going to go ahead and grab a copy of those and put them in project 1. And so we'll have references to those. We can change them if we need to. But what we're going to do is we're going to use variables to save references to the art and the position and other things. And then we're also going to use logic to decide when to move our character around the screen. And we're going to use events along with that logic so we can let the user interact with our project. So we're going to be reviewing 3 big concepts in this video. And so I'll try to, make sure that we cover everything we need to. But we will also be going over a lot of the basics in P5. So there's a lot to review here. So we'll just get started. So I'm going to hit Command N to make a new file. I'm just going to close these other ones. I don't really need these anymore. And I'm going to do save as. And I want to make sure that I'm in project 1. And I'm going to call this sketch.js. And so we'll get started. So we're going to add some variables to start. And so we can talk about a little bit about what a variable is. And we'll be adding a few different types of variables. To start with, we just need a couple of variables to save references to the images that we're going to use in our code. So this is kind of an important process and it's a bit abstract. So let's talk about it. So I'm going to put a little comment here just to say what this is. So this is project 1. This is like kind of our first version. And let's see, the date is September 1st. Other information that you might want to put here, go ahead. And if you have any notes or things that you want to remember. And so we're going to start with our global variables. Okay, so I'll talk about this a couple times in the video, but global variables are basically variables that go at the top of our program. There's a couple reasons we want them to be up here. One is just to make it easier to edit. If we write our code really well, we can make simple changes to our project just by looking at these variables instead of reading through all of the code. And it also, when we have these global variables, that means that they're accessible to all of our different functions. So we'll talk about that as we add our functions. So let's just talk about what a variable is. So we've written variables before in MMP 210, but let's just review it real quick. So I always start with VAR, which in JavaScript is one of the ways that we can create a variable. VAR basically stands for, it's an abbreviation for variable. And when we're writing a variable, we want to use what's called camel case. For my first image, I'm going to use the name of the character, Jerry, and then the idle for the idle image. And then I'm going to put a semicolon there for now to say that we just declared this variable. So that's a variable declaration. And when I declare the variable, I'm basically saying, if we have like our computer over here, okay, and we're, writing our code, our computer has something in it called the hard drive. So let's say this is the hard drive. And the hard drive basically just is a lot of computer memory. And so when we're writing a program, we're going to ask the hard drive to keep track of this image that we created. So on our computer, I'm going to open up the files over here. And on our computer, we created a couple of GIFs, the idle and the walk. And we're basically saying we want to have a short name for this on the hard drive. So we're saying Jerry idle, and that's going to point to this part of the hard drive where we save that data so that we can use it throughout our program. So a variable is basically like, sometimes people refer to it as like a bucket, where you just put in, so I'm putting the data from this image into the bucket and I'm giving it a name, Jerry idle. So this name is attached to the bucket. So anytime I want to use that image, I can just use the variable name instead of, writing out all the data, which is a lot of information. So variables can be used to hold any different type of information. In this case, with our first couple of variables, we are using data from the image, from the animation that we created so that we can display it on the screen. So that's basically what our program does, is it communicates between what we have on our hard drive and what we actually see on the screen. So we want to put our character on the screen. And so we're basically going to use our program. So our sketch.js file is going to go into the hard drive and grab it. And then it's going to tell us how to display it on the screen. So we use variables in a lot of different ways in our program in order to, do different things with numbers and logic and images and everything else that goes into our program. So besides the idle state, we also have the walk state. So I'm going to go ahead and add that now, Jerry walk. And so, you can see that the name of the variable is different from the name of the file. For the file, I put Jerry underscore idle and Jerry underscore walk. For the variable, I put Jerry idle with a capital I and Jerry walk with a capital W. So this isn't really necessary. I could write this however I want, but these are just the conventions that we use for these different languages. So on the computer, we want our files to have lowercase letters and underscores or dashes. But in JavaScript, we use a lowercase letter at the beginning of the variable name or function name, and then we use uppercase letters when we have another word in the variable. That's referred to as camel case because there's like a little hump in the variable. And if we added another word here, we would add another hump. So that makes it a little bit more readable because we can see that this is two words, Jerry idle. And so we can also see really quickly that we have two animations related to the character Jerry, and one is idle and one is walk. And we're going to look at a lot of different ways to kind of store this information throughout the semester, but for now, just working with simple variables, this is the best way to do it. So we have Jerry idle and we have Jerry walk. We basically have these two different references where we're going to load in our animations so that we can play them whenever we want. So we'll come back and add more variables in a moment, but for now, let's just load those images. So we're going to start with our preload function. This is the first function that we use in P5 to load all of our assets, whether they're images or audio or video, before we actually start drawing our program. So we're just going to load both of these images. So I'm going to say Jerry idle equals load image, and then I give it the path to the image. So this one is Jerry underscore idle dot gif. Again, this Jerry underscore idle just has to match whatever the file is. So the file on your computer. Whereas this variable, these don't have to match. Okay, they do have the same words, but they don't have to match. What's important is that this variable matches this variable. What goes in between my quotation marks here is a reference to the file on the computer versus the variable which I use in my program. So next we have Jerry walk. So we're going to load that image, Jerry underscore walk dot gif. And since we have these two variables, we'll be able to draw either image depending on what we want to see on the screen. Let's go ahead to our setup function. So we could do function setup. And so setup is basically a function that goes at the beginning after we preload and before we start drawing. So it just kind of sets up some basic parameters like the size of the canvas and some other things we'll add later. So we're just going to do a create canvas, and we'll do 640 by 480. And we'll add some other stuff in here later. I think for now this is fine. And then let's just draw our image. So let's say function draw. So draw is the function that continuously paints our graphics on the screen, which allows us to move the graphics around and make changes to make our project interactive. So for the draw function, let's draw a little background, just a kind of light gray color, and then let's draw our character. So we'll start with the idle. So I'm going to use the image function again, and just the first variable that goes in there is the reference to the image data on our computer. And then we go with 0, 0 for the position of the image. So we should be able to see the image now. So I'm going to go ahead and reload my project. Okay, so there's my idle image. We can see the animation is working. And if we change Jerry idle to Jerry walk, then we see that walk animation. So let's leave this at idle for now. We're going to add a few more things in here. So those are our basic variables that we started with. We're going to add a bunch more variables and talk about different ways to use variables. So we'll start that now. So our main goal for today, since we've already got our art here, is to move the art around the screen, which is going to be able to allow us to do things like create our platformer style game or an RPG style game, or even just like an interactive narrative where we're walking around in a scene. So today we're just focused on the user input and changing the character sort of avatar in a project. So in order to do that, we're going to need a position that we can change. So this is another place where we use variables. With our image variables, these variables never change. They just load that image data, and then they're always going to be a reference to that image data. But what we'll add now is some variables that we can actually update in order to move them around. So instead of just 0, 0, which are obviously two just numbers, which we refer to as hard coded because they're not variables, they can't change. So as long as that 0 and 0 are there, this character isn't going anywhere. It's always going to be drawn from the 0, 0 position of the canvas, which is this top left position right here. So if we want that to move, we need to use some variables. So we can create a couple variables. And so these will be our position variables. So we're going to have variable Jerry X for the X position, which is just the horizontal position, and Jerry Y for the Y position or the vertical. So again, I'm not initializing these variables. I'm just declaring them. I'm just saying that I want these things to exist. And one reason I'm not doing that is because I want to set these values in the middle of the screen. And at this point in our global variable setup, we actually don't know where the middle of the screen is yet because we haven't created the canvas yet. So once we create that canvas, that is going to tell us how big our canvas is, and therefore where the middle of the canvas is. So once we create the canvas, that actually establishes the P5 default variables, the width and the height. And we can see those variables in action in the console. So if I type in width, we get 640. If I type in height, we get 480. So once I do create canvas, besides creating the canvas on the screen, it also sets these width and height variables. So now that those variables exist, I can say Jerry X equals width over 2. And I can say Jerry Y equals height over 2. So that'll put, we'll divide the canvas by width in half and then by height in half. So we'll end up right in the middle. And then for this to actually work, I have to replace, I forgot the Y here. I have to replace this 0, 0 with my Jerry X and Jerry Y. So now when I reload the page, we'll see the character in the middle of the page. One thing you might notice is that he's not exactly centered because the real XY is probably, right here. Because right now, the way we have it set up is the image is going to draw from whatever this XY is to the right and then down. So we can change that by changing the image mode. So if we go to P5 image mode, you guys might remember this. This basically just determines if the image is drawn like from the corner or corners or from the center or other, I think those are the options. So the default is that it's drawn from the corner. So if this image is at 1010, you can see this is only a little bit offset from the canvas versus center, where now our image is centered. So if we go into setup and we say we want the image mode to be center, and center here is all caps because it's a variable that doesn't change. So one of the naming conventions for variables that always stay the same is that they're all caps. And so if we reload that page, now our character is really centered in the middle of the canvas. So instead of drawing from the top left of our image, it draws from the middle and it calculates the width and the height. So now we have an X and Y value, which we can change to move our character around. And we have declared those values in the global scope. And then we initialize the values. We gave them, a number in setup. And then we use them in draw. So this is another reason why we want global variables, because if I just said variable Jerry X here, then this variable would stop existing once we left the setup function down here. But if we declare the variable first up here, then we can reference it both in setup and in draw. So we can move our character around right now. If I just go over to the console and I say Jerry X equals 100, our character will move. But we want to move the character based on user input, not just by changing that number. And so to detect user input, we have to use two things. We have to use logic and we have to use event. Okay, so we're going to use logic, which is testing different conditions. and we're going to use events. So events are things that we can detect from the user input. And we're going to use this together to create our character movement. And so basically, we're just going to start by moving the character to the right by changing the X position. And remember that this is the draw function, so it's going to be happening repeatedly. So every time it's going about 60 frames per second, and every single frame it's asking, if we're going to the right. And we'll take out the background in a second so we can visualize that. For logic, we use a condition. And if you guys would probably remember, when we have a condition, we start with if. And inside our parentheses following the if, we evaluate the condition. So if something is true, then we execute the code that goes afterwards. And that code goes in between those curly brackets that come after the parentheses. So our first condition is if we're going to hit the right key. And I have a special event for this. It's in the P5 reference. So if I go to P5 events, you can see all of the different types of things that can happen. So we're going to be working with the keyboard, and one of our events is keyIsDown. So that'll tell us if the user is holding the key down. That's what we want to use in this case, because we're not looking for just one press. When we're going to be driving the character around, we're going to be holding the arrow keys down to determine which direction we want to go. So we're going to use the keyIsDown function. And so that's its own little function that is going to evaluate based on what key we give it, and that will either be true or false. So if it's true, then we'll run the code in here. If it's false, then this statement just doesn't happen. And so the first key we're going to look for is the right arrow key. Fortunately, P5 has a built-in method for this. So if we look at the key code reference in P5, you can see that P5 has some of the main interaction keys that we use, like backspace, enter, etc., have these kind of built-in variable names, so we don't have to use the numbers that we would normally use. So we're just going to use those. So let's start with the right underscore arrow. Okay, so that's the right arrow on the keyboard. You could also use, a lot of time for a game, you use the WASD keys for movement. If you wanted to do that, then you would actually have to use the number. And so you can find the number if you go to keycode.info. And if you press a key, it'll give you the number that you would want to use for the key code. So we can do both of those. Let's start with the right arrow. So if keyIsDown, right arrow, if that's true, then we want to move Jerry to the right. So the way that we do that is we change the Jerry X variable. So that's why we need a variable there, so that we can make a change to it. We can update that position. So we say Jerry X, and then we're going to use plus equals here. So we're not just going to set it to a value, because then it would always be that value. We're going to increment our value. So that's what this plus equals does. It takes the current value of Jerry X and it increases it by a little bit. So let's say 1 just to start. That's just going to add 1 to the X value. So I'm going to refresh the page. So over here, if I say Jerry X, I can see it's 320. That's half the canvas. And if I hit the right arrow a few times or hold it down, now it's going to be up to 413. So when we started, it was around here, and now it's around here. And so that way we can allow our user to move the character. This 1 value is not very good. He doesn't really move very fast. So let's increase that value, maybe about 5. Okay, maybe that's a little too fast. Maybe we'll try 3. That looks pretty good. So this 3, since we're obviously going to be moving in lots of different directions, we're going to have to repeat this value. That's another reason to use a variable, is because even though this value might not change over time, if we have a variable with the number 3 in it, then we can apply that speed in all directions. And if we want to change it later, we just have to change it once as opposed to changing it 4 times, because we do have 4 directions with the character. So I'm going to replace this with Jerry speed. And then I'm going to go back up to the global scope, and I'm going to say variable Jerry speed equals 3. So that way, if I want to change how fast Jerry can move, I can just go up here and change this number. And so this variable declaration here is a little different than the other ones we did. This is a declaration and an initialization. So we're declaring the variable by saying var Jerry speed, and we're also initializing it by saying equals 3. So we can do that in one line as opposed to 2 lines like we did with our image variables and our position variables. Okay, so you might want to pause here and just to kind of test your understanding, try to make the character move in all 4 directions instead of just to the right, which is all mine can do right now. So try pausing the video and seeing if you can figure that out. And then once you're ready, come back and I'll just go through the answer. Okay, so to do this, instead of typing it, I'm going to save myself a little time. I'm just going to copy that, Command C. I'm going to paste it 1, 2, 3 times. So we're going to move in 4 directions. We have 4 different if statements. So that looks like a lot of code, but they're all pretty much the same thing. So we have going to the right. So let's go to the left. So I'm first going to change this value to left arrow, and then I'm going to change the plus to a minus. So we're just going to go in the opposite direction. Everything else stays the same. We're still looking at key is down. It's still a condition if the key is down. Jerry X is still our X position, and Jerry speed is still the amount that we change over time. So now I can go right or left. And it's going a little faster to the right because I have these others. So I'm just going to comment this out real quick, which is just command question mark or / just comment it out. Okay, so now I can go right or left. And if I hold both keys at the same time, they cancel each other out. Okay, so that's right and left. I'm going to bring these guys back. So then we go up and down. So for up, we have to change the axis. So we're not working with the X value anymore. We're working with the Y value. And going up, if you remember with P5, Y starts at 0. Y starts at 0 up here, and then it goes bigger as it goes down. So this is like 480. So if we want to go up, we actually have to go minus on the Y. So Jerry Y minus equals Jerry speed. And then for down, we can leave the plus. So that's the down arrow, and this is Jerry Y. Okay, so now I can move in all directions, and I can also move in 2 directions at once at diagonals, which is necessary. Or some games actually you can only move in one axis at a time, but depending on how you want it to set up, you might want to be able to move at diagonals. If you didn't want the character to be able to move in different directions, you can change these to else if. So I could put an else if here, else if here, else if here. So then it'll prioritize this first arrow. So now if I go right, I can't go up and down at the same time. But for this example, I'm just going to leave these all as if statements so that they act independently, which means that if I hit 2 arrows at the same time, then I'll move diagonally. Or if I hit the right and left at the same time, it cancels itself out. Or if I hit up and down at the same time, also it cancels out. So we've reviewed logic, we've reviewed events, and we've reviewed variables. We're going to add one more component to this sketch. Which is changing the artwork depending on whether we're walking or not. And so we're actually going to use another variable for that and some logic as well. And so for this variable, we actually don't need this to be in the global scope because it's going to change in the draw function. You could put it in the global scope, but we can put it right here. So we just want to know basically if the character is walking or not. And for this example, we only have either idle or walking. In later examples, we probably will have to add more to that. But for now, we can just use an on-off or a Boolean. And so we can review Booleans. So for our character will say Jerry is walking. And we're going to set this to false. So we're going to start at the beginning of the program each frame, assuming that Jerry is not walking. And so if I don't hit any keys, then Jerry will not be walking, and we can leave the idle animation. But if I hit any of the keys, Jerry's going to start moving, and so we're going to want Jerry to walk. So we can say, if the key right arrow is down, we can say Jerry is walking, and we can say that's true. There's ways to simplify this, but for now, we're just going to copy this and put it in each one of our if statements. So not only do we move Jerry's position, we also set this is walking. And so then we change the image based on whether or not Jerry is walking. So we would say if Jerry is walking. Okay, so that's just true or false. We're not evaluating it like the key is down. It's just going to be false if nothing's happened, and it'll be true if one of our keys is pressed. So if it's true, then we're going to draw the Jerry walk image, and we're going to draw it in the same place. So Jerry X and Jerry Y. Okay, if it's false, then we do the else statement, and we put this in here. So with our if statement, if this is true, we do the first part, but we can add an else statement here to say if Jerry's walking is not true, then we stick with the idle image. So I'm going to save that, go back here. So he's not walking and it's idle. And as soon as I start to hit the arrow, because this part happens first, we test the events first and we set Jerry walking to true. Then by the time we get down here to actually draw the image, so let's say draw character image. Now we can see that idle animation. Okay, so when I go to the left, he does appear to be going backwards. So if you really wanted to like improve this project, you could add a few more animations or just reverse this animation to make it look like he's not walking backwards. I'll leave that up to you guys. I'm not going to do that for this sketch. So let's go ahead and publish this project. We're going to continue working on it, so we may make some changes before it's done. But since it is early in the semester, we can just review publishing on GitHub. So I may not do this in every video, but I'll do it for now. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my GitHub desktop app. And I don't have my MMP 310 set up here. So what I'm going to do is go to add local repository, and then I'm going to click choose, go to the desktop MMP 310 and click open. And then I'm going to click add repository. And so we can see we've made some changes in the past, but we have a bunch of new changes here. And so I'm going to just add those changes. So I have to add the summary first. So I'm going to say adds Piscal and project 1 examples. And I'm going to click commit to master. And then I'm going to click push origin. And so then if I click view on GitHub, it's going to take me to my GitHub project. And if I want to view the live project, I can go to settings and scroll down and click on GitHub pages. Or I can just go to onbmcc.github.io/mmp310. And then hopefully if I click project 1, there we see our first project. And so let's make one more update to this. So what I want to do is put in a new thumbnail here since we have something new for our project 1. And there's a really easy way to do that with P5. What I'm going to do, there's a built-in function in P5, which is the save function. So if I look at P5 save, if I run this function, it's just going to save an image of the canvas. So I could do this in my actual P5 code, but I can also just do it in the console. So I can go to the console and do save and hit enter. And it's going to make this image down here. So I'm going to go up here. It just says untitled. There's our character. So I'm just going to call this thumbnail. And I'm going to drop this thumbnail into project 1. And so now if I want a different image in my portfolio layout, I can go to index.html. And instead of this default thumbnail, I can say project 1. And then it's actually a PNG, not a JPEG. So I'll change that to PNG. And so now if I refresh the local version, Now you see that project 1 with our art there. You could also, create your own image in Photoshop or something like that if you wanted a bigger image there. But then when we go to project 1, there we go. So if we want to upload that one, I just go back to GitHub desktop. You can see the changed image there as well as the image PNG. So I'm just going to say adds project 1 thumbnail and commit to master. And then I'm going to push that to the origin. When I reload this page, it'll take a second. And there we go. So we have our new thumbnail for project 1. And so that's it for this video. Let me know if you need help with anything. This is mostly review, but there's a lot of material in here. So if you need help with anything, we can go over it. And so we're just going over some basic stuff, and we'll continue to add to this project and hopefully build up some sort of game or some sort of interactive story over the next few weeks. So that's going to be our first project. For the second project, we'll probably move into something else, but we'll see when we get there.